Welcome to NucleCast, the official podcast of the NY Deterrence Center. Our host is Dr. Adam Lowther, co-founder and vice president for research at the National Institute for Deterrence Studies. The NY Deterrence Center is a 501c3 organization ensuring a broader understanding of the nation's strategic nuclear deterrence and its ongoing modernization. Thank you for listening and welcome to the show. The views of the host and the guests are their own.
Welcome back to another exciting episode of NucleCast. Of course, I'm your host, Adam Lowther, and today we have Zak Kallenborn, who is a friend of NucleCast. He's been on, it's been a while. It's been at least a year or so. But Zak is, of course, our drone expert extraordinaire. You know, he writes, if you've not read his work, Zak, Z-A-K, Kallenborn. It's phonetic. Go look him up. He's got a lot of great articles and reports, so you got to read his work and follow him. So, Zak, welcome to NucleCast.
Thanks for having me.
So we sort of have a thread that we're going to pull today in our discussion, and we want to start with California's SB 1047, which is a bill in the California legislature that is about artificial intelligence safety. So could you give us maybe a little description of that, and then we'll start pulling that thread?
Yeah, exactly. So this is a law that came out of California, and it got vetoed just about last month. I believe it was September 29th. But it reflects a larger trend of significant interest around AI, and particularly the concerns at the intersection of AI and chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear weapons. A big element of this bill was trying to establish mandatory safety and security audits and requirements on some of these artificial intelligence models. And specifically was narrowed to what are termed frontier models, basically the really high-end ones where you're using large amounts of computers and large amounts of data to train these things. So, you know, the more potentially scary ones. And so what's gotten a lot of people's we'll say underwear in a bind, is that they're concerned about what AI might do for larger proliferation and access to these weapons. You know, the scare is that, you know, a future bioterrorist will go on to ChatGPT or, you know, whatever version you have in the future and be like, hey, how do I build a bioweapon? And it'll spit out precise instructions. Of course, you know, there's various security measures and there's already various safety things that, you know, you can't go that explicit. And at the moment, the chat will just say, you know, well, that's illegal. We can't do it anyway. But even in theory, that you can work around, there are ways to work around these things. But the concern is, you know, folks will find those ways, and that, you know, this AI will be so smart and so intelligent that, you know, it'll teach those of us who don't have any chemistry or biology background, like how do I make one of these weapons, and in a very technical and precise way. And so that was kind of the idea of the bill, but ultimately it did get vetoed for a variety of reasons. There was a huge falderall over this particular bill. There were folks on both sides, all over Twitter, all over the news, pushing some for, some against, especially against were many of the AI companies. But it wasn't a pure, you know, company versus other folks like Nancy Pelosi and other prominent political leaders in California also were against the bill. And the concern was, you know, that we don't just know enough about some of these risks, and how realistic is it that, you know, we can use AI to actually build some of these chemical and biological weapons? And that was particularly my concern, as I was one of the folks opposed to it, relatively minor one compared to all the others. But you know, that's definitely, it's an open question, how much risk there actually is. You know, to actually work in a bio facility and make some of these things actually really hard. So how much do you actually get out of the AI system? And so, you know, the companies were understandably concerned that, like, you know, we're having to adopt all these new security, all these safety measures on something that we're not really sure what exactly is going on here. And there was enough, you know, vagaries in the law that folks were concerned that, you know, an angry prosecutor who just doesn't like Facebook or Meta or whatever for some particular reason, or Google, or, you know, is like using this law as an excuse to persecute and sort of address some of the, you know, just go after the company. So there's a lot of sort of concerns, but, you know, for certainly this discussion, we could focus on some of those, you know, larger national security.
Don't we have a lot of product liability law, you know, already on the books that we can say, hey, listen, if you design a product and that product, you know, if you take a look at you know, the COVID shots, we had a federal, law that alleviated those companies from having any liability. So it took an act of Congress to say you can kill people and you won't be liable. But
Yeah.
without that, they're liable. So wouldn't these companies be sort of, careful with what they design for the sake of the fact that they know that they can be sued, and that lawsuits can, depending upon who gets hurt and how many and all that, they could be in the millions and tens of millions of dollars and essentially, destroy a company. So is there not an incentive to somewhat be careful already?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that was part of the, concern that these companies had. That said, that was also an argument that people in favor of the bill were making. It was like, okay, these liability laws are already accepted. And all this is really doing is reminding people of these, what already exists. Then personally, I have to wonder, well, if all you're doing is reminding it, why do you need a new, a legislation to do that? But I tend to agree. And part of the issue that I saw with this as well is, how broad it potentially could be. Because we think about enabling a CBRN attack, there's a lot of things that go into a CBRN attack. It's not just, getting that weapon system itself. You could imagine, for example, using an AI deepfake to try to get access to someone's system, or just a minor, as part of like an intelligence reconnaissance type thing to scout out a potential target and use AI in that way. So if that ultimately led to a CBRN attack, would that company be liable? But at the same time, like creating just a video of, me or you or anyone else is not exactly a, super advanced capability. And so I think part of the issue was that, like, the law didn't really specify very well, like, which parts are the real concerns here when it comes to enabling these types of attacks.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I've been reading some of the books on COVID and the COVID pandemic and how it took place, and so the wisdom now is that this was in fact created in the lab in Wuhan. That's the the intelligence community's accepted wisdom now, and we know who patient zero was, who was a gain of function researcher in the lab, and so I, as you were talking and explaining this, I was thinking, well, we have this project that is funded by Bill Gates that's, going out around the world, climbing into bat caves, trying to find every vaccine. They're going to find every virus in the world, bring it into labs, and then they're going to manipulate it in gain of function research so that they can then they're going to make it dangerous so that they can then develop the vaccine for it. That's this project that Bill Gates is funding. And then of course, a lot of these viral designs are, they're on the internet, they're publicly available in research, in published research. And so if AI learns by what it can find on the internet, then our effort to go out and find and then, manipulate viruses, to me, would essentially, and which of course is then public, your AIs that you're talking about would then be able to go do the very thing that we are afraid that they'll do, because we've created the research and made that research public that they then go and use. And to me, it would, it's just sort of not a well thought out program that, AI would inevitably go and find that information, because it, as it crawls the web and incorporates information and learns, and that's these large language models and all of this, the learning tools that they have. So I sort of, can you really blame the AI for doing what AIs, are essentially designed to do? Or do we need to demonstrate some, better control in other areas? Because I think we understand artificial intelligence and how it works and what it does and why it does that. And then doesn't it become more incumbent upon us to, do a better job of sort of wrangling it?
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there, and I have to say you're kind of sounding like one of the so-called doomers of where AI is going to, cause this mass proliferation of bioweapons. I'll say that definitely, that's I think a big part of these folks' concern who've really been pushing this law. That is, they're bringing in information like gain of function, and then you can sort of use that. And I think there is a genuine concern there that we should be worrying about that. Part of the reason why I'm somewhat more skeptical is that there's so much of biology is really the skills that come from working in the lab itself, and there's only so much really you can get from just simply sharing what's written down. My favorite example is personal. It's a bit silly, but I think it illustrates these points. So I took a microbiology class when I was I think it was high school, undergrad, something like that, and it was a 9 a.m. thing, and I was absolutely awful at it. I did okay at the test. I think it was B's plus, maybe an A minus every once in a while, but I was absolutely terrible at the lab. So much so that I literally set multiple fires. My worst part was at one point I was working and then I dropped a glob of bacteria on my notebook and I didn't notice it. And then I came back to my dorm afterwards and then found it like this dime-sized glob of bacteria on my notebook. And then about a week or so later, my dorm mate got down with a pretty bad case of staph infection, and we were working with staphylococcus in the lab. I don't know that it's my fault, but the point being is you shouldn't need an AI to tell you don't set fires, don't drop this stuff. Now that's a silly example, but more largely, many of the skills that folks work in the lab, those are things that you can't really get the textbook for. We know from biology research in general, from reports back when we had the weapons program, folks would point out that working with a new agent was actually really hard because the skills that they had developed in working with other types of plague or whatever didn't readily transfer to working with, I don't remember what it was, I think it was Marburg or something like that. And there may be ways that AI could help that, if we think about automated biological equipment where the AI does just takes over and does that thing, so I don't need to worry about dropping the bacteria, the AI does that. That's possible. But part of the challenge is I don't think we understand well where these risks are, and we weren't necessarily testing for them. We're not thinking about them. That said, in the future, I think we will, absolutely. Actually, I think it was just yesterday, the White House signed a new national security memorandum on AI. One element to that, which I think is a great idea, is developing some classified testing things where, you probably could actually, and, you may even be able to work with the real agents in some of these particular cases, since we have some of that, as part of our biodefense program. I think long story short, I think there's definitely some risks there and we need to work on understanding them, but I don't think we do yet. And so jumping to a lot of regulation and legislation is maybe not the best idea.
Yeah. I mean, I'm with you on that one. I do wonder, if you think about, just think about government in general. And I was trying to think about that one problem that government solved it with, laws and regulations. I can't think of what it is. I mean, I can't think of any problem government solved with regulation. So the question that the idea that, and to say, well, AI is the problem and therefore we need to regulate it and stop it, when in fact that might not be what the problem is. But I do, if you think about, thinking about terrorism, because I think a lot of the concern is because large states like China or Russia, they can do this. They've had large biological weapons programs. They have the skills. But if we think about, terror groups, I just finished reading I don't know if you've heard of a guy, Masab Hassan Yusuf. He was the son of the founder of Hamas. And he was they called him, he worked for Shin Bet, the domestic spy agency in Israel. And he was called the Green Prince. The books are great. If you've not read them, he tells the story of how he got involved. But at any rate, he talks a lot about the Hamas, terrorists that he worked with. And the funny thing was they were all engineers, because they had all gone to school to become engineers. And then, lo and behold, they become bomb makers. Well, engineers probably make good bomb makers. And so I wonder, would we see and a lot of them were educated in, Western universities or universities in Israel, for example, the Open University. And so I wonder, would we see, this diversification of skill sets, where instead of, the smart terrorists and the leaders of the organization saying, let's go become engineers, saying, well, you know what, we need biologists and we need chemists and then, so maybe they're not, and it's not necessarily that they don't have the skills, but it's maybe they don't have these, the large biolabs like in Wuhan. Maybe they're working in much smaller facilities. And it's not that, AI just gives them that extra help that they might need. But I wouldn't even necessarily blame AI for that. The problem is they're going to have all the precursor agents, and they're going to have, a lot of stuff that will have been produced probably by, Western scientists that they then got a hold of and then sort of put the pieces together.
Yeah, that's kind of where my inclination is as well, is like, even if we imagine that AI does get much better, and I should briefly note that, there actually has been a number of red teaming efforts, some of which the results are now open source, have been published, done by Rand Corporation. I think Meta has done some. There was also, I think OpenAI did a little bit of their own, where they looked at like, okay, how much does this actually help with building these systems? And pretty much across the board, the answer has been it doesn't. Like, really at all. Like, I think in the last OpenAI had the strongest conclusion of helping, and basically all of the help that the AI was given was basically kind of speeding up the process, but it wasn't specific in terms of how much it sped up the process. Are we talking about like you took a 10-minute task and now it's 5 minute? Like, probably not a big deal. But I think down the road, there is that potential. But to me, I come up with much the same conclusion as you, that like, is it really even if this becomes, fantastically better, is it really the AI that's driving it versus the access to the precursors? Because
exactly,
if you can't get access to, your thiodiglycol or your Bacillus anthracis specimen, like,
or the DNA, you have to buy DNA that you then, manipulate, right? You're putting furin cleavage sites on viruses, and you're doing all this stuff, and you got to have stuff to make that happen. So, and you got to have,
exactly.
Like, you got to have coded genes. Yeah.
Where you start, I think, where there may be a fair argument for AI being really scary is, to what extent can it sort of find the ways to actually do that? And like, I struggle to imagine what this would look like in practice, but at least theoretically, I could imagine there's a, AI that's like, okay, here's a vulnerable facility that contains thiodiglycol. Here's why it's vulnerable. Here's how I exploit it. But even then, it's like, there's going to be so much, skill that actually is directly involved with the AI can't teach you. Like, okay, let's imagine it finds the perfect facility where you can steal thiodiglycol or whatever. And it points out, like, here's 4 different security vulnerabilities. Here's the time you need to rob it. Here's the route you need to go. Like, you still got to be able to exploit all of those things. Like, I know certainly I could not do that. I'm really nervous. I have like anxiety issues. Like, just the idea of doing that would like kind of freak me out. And there's like zero chance I wouldn't get caught, by like the FBI or some other anything. So the point being is like, there's still going to be these sort of skill bases that, even if it becomes much, much more fantastic than it is now, you're still going to have all of those requirements that I think are really difficult to get around, and still places where, government intervention and, support from intelligence communities, from, folks at DOD, local law enforcement, all are, the aperture and system that we've built post 9/11 to control and, these things. All of that's going to be just as relevant, even if a world where this AI gets fantastically better at what it's doing.
Yeah. Now it's that time of the show where we have to take a quick break. But when we come back, I want to sort of shift topics and move. We've been talking about AI, and you're a drone guy. So I want to talk about, I've been thinking a lot about how do we, build drones that are AI enabled that can, we don't need, I've watched videos of Ukrainian soldiers, in these FPV drones, and they're hunting down Russians but why do you even need a human? Why aren't we building drones and just saying, hey, if you see this kind of uniform, go kill it. You see this vehicle, go kill it, and letting them loose. And I would think that the Ukraine case would be a great one. So when we come back, we're going to switch topics. You're listening to NucleCast, and we'll be right back. This episode of NucleCast is brought to you by the ANWA Deterrence Center, whose mission is to educate Americans about the nuclear enterprise and strategic deterrence. And we're back. We're talking to Zak Kallenborn. Now we sort of had this interesting AI discussion, and we were talking about, C. Bernie stuff and biological agents, but I want to take AI and now move it over to drones, and then we got to talk drones and can they kill nukes before we end the show. But have you been thinking about this, and sort of what's the next evolution of drones, and sort of Ukraine being the proving ground for all of this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I have quite a few articles, folks, if they're interested, can read it all on my website. So, yes, I think there is a big convergence there, and both states are interested in increasingly doing this. So far, we've seen relatively limited amounts of that sort of AI drone fusion. A lot of what we've seen has been more for like terminal guidance type systems where, the drone is coming in and it's, maybe like 500 meters or feet or whatever away. And then it uses the AI to confirm that, oh, yes, that's actually the target that, the human operator said, like, oh, that looks like that glob of pixels that the operator said, like, okay, let's make sure that I'm still, hitting it in the event of jamming or other interference. And that's a big part of why folks want it, that is jamming. Something that we've seen in the Ukraine-Russian conflict on both sides, they're jamming each other's systems significantly, both in terms of the command and control units to send the drone here and there, as well as the GPS or GNSS systems used for the navigation to make sure the drone is going to the same place. And so folks have been pursuing AI and general autonomy to sort of get around that, because if you don't need the human saying, go over here, then that's fine. And similarly, folks are developing AI-based systems to help with the navigation support, where you might have, for example, a camera that's looking at the ground around it and saying, oh, look, there's that mountain over here, there's that river over here, and then let's compare against the map inside my computer and say, okay, I must be over here. And then based on what they knew from, when they had GPS access, like, okay, I know where my location now is, and I know where I need to go, and can go along that. So there's a lot of interest in that on both sides, absolutely. The challenge, though, is getting a lot of that right and getting the technology to do so. Because, the challenge terrain can be so very, very different. And especially in a battlefield context where, things might get blown up. You might have debris, you might have smoke. What happens if it's rainy or cloudy or foggy or any, million different permutations that come into the place. And similarly, if you're flying over water, like there's not really any land masses to differentiate, right, this pot of ocean versus this other one. So there's a lot of very real limitations. In fact, we saw with, I think it was the Russian Lancet, where that's a Russian loitering munition system that meant to kind of like fly around and look for targets. And then an operator says, all right, there's a tank over there, go blow it up. There was some indications that they were using it autonomously, sort of as you described, like, okay, let's look around, search for a tank, found a tank, and then just autonomously go blow it up. But then they appear to have turned it off because they found it actually didn't really work all that well. Because part of the that problem of the machines at the moment, and that's exactly what some of the issues we're hitting with some of the CBRN issues, and why some of the lack of effectiveness on that is that they tend to hallucinate, they tend to make mistakes. These aren't human brains yet. Maybe down in the future, maybe, some folks do think, we could have human level intelligence in the next few years. I'm personally skeptical about that. But there are people in the know who believe that confidently. But clearly we're not there yet. And so that's been part of the issue, is like these potential for mistakes is not working as well as one would like. But certainly all sides, and as well as the United States and China and others, are certainly pursuing this technology very, very actively.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because I would expect that exactly what we're talking about. How far in the future do you think something akin to that would be in terms of being able to be deployed?
So akin to what? Do you mean like a full, like a human level intelligence? Do you mean? Or
no, not general intelligence, but just sort of having drones that have small explosives that, we sort of send them in a general direction and say, hunt for a soldier, hunt for a tank, hunt for a, and then, either come back or blow up.
Yeah. So there's multiple layers to this. So the basic technology, that's here. Absolutely. Doing it reliably in many of these contexts, that I'm less sure. And I'm not as much of a technologist myself, so I hesitate to speculate a little bit. But I will speculate a little bit, but I'll give that caveat. Like, this is not like, I don't know that down and gritty technology is that particularly well. But my general sense is, potentially multiple years. But that said, we have been working on it for a while, so it's possible it's getting closer and closer. But I was just talking to some technologists the other day who were pointing out like, we're not really there yet. We got stuff to go. That said, it's possible that some other folks figured it out and have much better approaches. I don't really know. But the larger point, though, is that the actual technology is here. Doing it reliably is more of the challenge, though.
Yeah. Now, if we're having this kind of trouble looking at tanks, one of the things I sort of envision was, for the U.S., part of our targeting of adversary nuclear weapons for are mobile weapons, right? By the time we shoot something, they'll move. And therefore we can't effectively count on destroying those adversary weapons. The North Koreans, the Chinese, the Russians, they all have mobile weapons. But what if we had drones that, let's say we could drop drones that looked like rocks in a, sort of in an area, and then we can activate those drones and say, hey, listen, if you, here's what a tell and here's what the missile looks like, go find it and then, get close and detonate and sort of disable it. So you've sort of answered the question that we're not necessarily quite there yet. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if for those of us, for the listeners who are, predominantly in the nuclear enterprise and think about nuclear weapons, how do you see sort of the AI and drones and all of this playing together to be relevant to the nuclear enterprise in the years ahead?
Yeah, so there's a few dimensions of it. So, although I don't think we're quite there yet in terms of that, finding the tells and whatnot automatically, certainly one can imagine using with an operator. That's going to, of course, depend on the actual state. Probably, having a drone operator operating for an extended period of time in North Korea and not getting caught and killed or anything like that, probably very, very difficult. And if you can get that, you're probably only talking pretty small numbers there where you're not necessarily going to be, finding all of the various systems. But that might be different in the United States. I think one of the concerns that many people have is that these mystery drones that have been showing up around, around ICBM sites, as well as I know there's a whole bunch in Banger Kits-Up, where there's a bunch of
subs. Yeah.
And that can be very, very critical, even though it's not exactly hard to locate, like, where's the silos, you can monitor for patterns of life, look for indicators in ways that you might not necessarily otherwise, because you think about like satellites passing overhead, we can track those relatively well and know that, there's a satellite coming overhead. We better, start doing this or hide this or do whatever. But you don't necessarily have that with a drone that might just be showing up at random, even in a time when normally satellites wouldn't be effective because of weather or whatnot. So I think that intelligence collection is absolutely very concerning there. And I think even if the ground environment might be a bit more difficult, the undersea environment is of course a bit different, where you don't necessarily have as much clutter, and so you can imagine drones undersea being spread out to help search for submarines or attack them if you find them.
Just sitting. I can imagine. Explosive drones literally sitting outside, the sea lanes where the subs are coming out, right? They're going to have to come out of port. Mm-hmm. And, we know that in the 1980s, there were incidents outside, in Britain, and there were incidents in Russia where attack submarines from the other side were sitting there waiting for the boomers to come out, and then they picked up their sound, they followed them, and then there was a collision. Mm-hmm. So we know that subs can do that. Could you imagine and of course, we've built efforts to try to detect that and stop that. And, we've had successes there, but I can imagine, much smaller drones, which therefore are much quieter, which, run, deep and silent, could potentially be missed. And, that could be a problem in and of itself. So it's both, air, or let's say drone swarms, right? I've been to baseball games where, at the baseball games, they have the drone shows and they, they're a light show. But I can imagine like, what if drone swarms were to attack, launch facilities, ICBM launch facilities in, and maybe one drone can't destroy, that blast door, that concrete door, but a swarm might could, or all you have to do is disable it so that the ICBM can't leave its launch facility. So there's so much potential there that is sort of, maybe we're not there yet, but in the years ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. And just introducing the uncertainty of that, that can be destabilizing, in and of itself, especially like in the middle of the crisis. Like, how well do we know? What if, like, even if it isn't necessarily like, completely destroy or make a major issue, if there's just the uncertainty, it's more difficult, or it costs us time, or anything of that sort would be a problem in of itself. And I think it's not only the drones itself, but also sort of the information processing that, potentially, and the intelligence value that you can potentially get, where, you have all these drones out there and they're collecting all sorts of data, and then you sort of use AI to sort of process and analyze, and maybe you might be able to find subtle signals that you might not otherwise pick up on about, like, okay, here's where the submarines are and that type of thing. Now, of course, the ocean being as vast as it is, and drones being even big undersea drones being the size that they are, I'm kind of skeptical that you're going to get like the any sort of like real time true transparency. But I don't think that's even necessary to generate some of these risks. So like if we imagine that we use that AI to process, we have our massive swarms of drones that are searching the ocean and looking around. That's going to generate huge amounts of data, and so we imagine that we're going to use AI to do that. Probably that's going to take a little bit of time. And, by the time that we process and analyze that submarine might very well be gone from where it is. So it may not be useful for like a more real-time targeting. However, one could imagine that once you start picking up those signals, you can then also figure out trends within those signals. Are there any patterns of behavior that are discernible, especially in combination with other information we might know, or an adversary might know about us, about doctrine, operations, behaviors, other types of intelligence information, because if we can start figuring out patterns, then we can start potentially anticipating where the submarine will be. And then we can validate that or reject that with future data, which then may, create higher degrees of maybe not immediate transparency, but at least anticipation. And if you know where the submarine is going to be, then you can figure out, where do I need my weapon systems to be, and then you can create a much larger threat to that force and to that larger, second strike stability.
Now we're about out of time, but I didn't want to end the show without bringing out, of course, Bob the Genie. And so as I rub my magic lamp and Bob grants you 3 wishes about the topics we've been discussing, Zach, what is wish number 1?
My wish number 1 is, and I think we've already gotten a little bit of this with this new AI national security memorandum, is that the U.S. government, and specifically the national security complex, works very closely together and develops new systems to collaborate with AI companies. I think part of the reason why I didn't like SB 1047 is very antagonistic. It's, the AI companies are evil. We need to put things on, maybe not literally evil, but it was, it was not a collaborative relationship, I think, to build these things. And I think there needs to be that collaborative relationship on multiple levels, because AI, I think, can also be really useful for our security. It's not just a threat, because you can imagine using AI to improve detectors and say, look for subtle signs of terrorist movement or activities, especially with like massive financial data where, at least certainly my eyes glaze over looking at any of that. And I'm sure even the people who do this professionally kind of glaze over sometimes, but using AI to find some of those subtle signals, I think is really, really important. So I'd wish for a much greater level of collaboration. And then second, I would wish for a much more focused and directed effort on understanding all of these different risk pathways, as well as the different mechanisms to do so. So a lot of like the current red teaming work has been focusing on like, okay, let's try to like build scenarios and let's try to, do it in a pure text type thing about and see how much information this can provide. But I'm not aware that anyone has really looked at like, okay, what happens if we equip it to the automated bio equipment or stuff like that? How well could folks use it in that way, or like mesh it with some of these real world issues that we've talked about? I think there's a little bit of that, but not nearly enough. But I think that needs to expand and really more precisely, and then as well as and then I suppose my number 3 would be much better understanding of the precise risk mitigation measures, and thinking about that entirety of that process and where those gaps are. because there might be gaps that are related to AI, absolutely, and there might be other gaps that are very critical that actually it's not really the AI that's really the driver. I think, for example, of not really much of a CBRN issue, but I suppose a little bit, is of cyber vulnerabilities at like water treatment plants, for example. And so, okay, if an AI is able to exploit some of those cybersecurity vulnerabilities, that might actually just be that we have an issue at the water facility and that we have a cybersecurity issue rather than an AI issue, especially if what the AI is doing is just, searching broadly for vulnerabilities rather than coming up with some novel like malware or something like that. Like it might be that the issue actually has nothing to do with AI. So being, considering that full scope of risk pathways or risk mitigation pathways and options, I think I would absolutely wish for.
All right. 3 good wishes. Zak Kallenborn, thanks for joining us on this episode of NucleCast.
Yeah. Thanks for having me again.
And thanks to you, the listeners, and we'll see you on the next episode. Well, Zach is always interesting. So I don't know about you, but I really enjoyed that discussion. Trying to pull those threads, where you take multiple technologies and think about how can they be used together. That's one of those things that we have to think through. And it's always sort of interesting to see what is the difference between where, what we can think of and where we actually are, and to kind of effectively measure that distance. So talking about that's always good. It's always good to hear from Zach.
This has been a production of the NY Deterrence Center, a 501c3 that seeks to educate key decision makers, stakeholders, and the public to ensure a broader understanding of the nation's strategic nuclear deterrent. Our executive producer is Kimberly Charrington, and this episode has been engineered and mixed by David Grunthal. Help us grow our followers by sharing it and follow the show on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at NucleCast.